Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about deviance and crime, and I'm just going to highlight some of the key ideas from your book to supplement everything that you've hopefully read up to this point. So, whenever we think about deviance, I think most people, whenever we think about deviance, view that unfavorably as if it's a bad thing. Sometimes it might be a bad thing, maybe other times it's not. There is such a thing, and I believe your book talks about this as positive deviance, and that's whenever people are too far above the bar or excel too much. You're not within the norm in terms of your brain power or being a genius. If you think about Einstein, or if you think about the Michael Jordans of the world, those athletes, or even innovative and creative people. Artists or musicians or whatever might be the case. Those could be instances of positive deviance because there's still something, not typical of those individuals in terms of their work or their way of thinking, or activists. I believe your book does talk about Rosa Parks as being a positive deviance. So just kind of bear that in mind, that not all deviance is necessarily quote unquote bad. But generally, whenever we do think about deviance, it refers to behavior that violates expected rules or norms. And generally, there's two broad types of deviance. The first is formal deviance, and those are instances where particular acts might be violating codified laws or official rules of an organization or institution. So things like speeding or shoplifting or cheating on an exam, all those things, of course, would be considered formal deviance. Informal deviance, on the other hand, would be violations of customary norms, mostly folkways, if you can refer to that from your book. But just standard norms of how we expect people to behave, or to some extent how we expect people to appear. So if we think about women, some women have shaved heads, but typically that's not part of the norm of femininity. So that could be seen as a informal act of deviance, a woman with a shaved head, or men wearing dresses, or professionals with tattoos, those sorts of things where it's not necessarily the end of the world, but it does kind of violate what we expect in terms of those individuals, in terms of their identities, or like I said, their work roles, or whatever the case might be. There's four big considerations that we should bear in mind as we begin thinking about deviance. So just four cultural, to a large extent, cultural components that can help us to make better sense of why particular acts or behaviors or norms or violation of norms, etc., are framed as deviant. So the first is that social context and history matter. So all deviance, to some extent, is what we call socially constructed. It's created and maintained by us. And we can see this whenever we see those instances in which identical behavior might be viewed differently depending on the context. So something that's completely acceptable in one setting might be a major violation in another setting. So a couple of quick examples just to illustrate this before we move on to the next one. Is reading a sociology textbook deviance? Of course not. It's something, of course, that I expect you to do, but context does matter. So if you're, in your apartment or dorm, or if you're at the library or at a coffee shop, reading a textbook, completely acceptable. No one would really bat an eye. But if this weekend you went to a party and you showed up with your sociology textbook, people would probably look at you kind of weird. So in that instance, it'd be seen as an act of deviance in that particular situation. Or thinking about what we're going through right now, going through this pandemic, is standing too close to someone an act of deviance? It might be. I mean, our norms in terms of personal space have certainly shifted over the last 3 months. So these things are in flux, certainly. Wearing a mask, I mean, kind of the debate about that, and just the expectations of wearing a mask if you're in a public place, a grocery store, a restaurant, whatever the case might be. These things shift based on the period of time and the context we find ourselves in. And then one other thing I like to sometimes think about is tattoos and whether tattoos are considered deviant. So if we had asked this question, 40 or 50 years ago, tattoos almost overwhelmingly would be seen as deviant because it was generally, sailors and criminals basically that had tattoos, whereas today it pretty much is mainstream. Even almost seen as a rite of passage. To get your first tattoo. And there's a vast majority of people in your generation, especially that have at least one visible tattoo. We're starting to see norms in workplaces change where it used to be almost unheard of to be a professional and have a visible tattoo. But today, I think it's 33% of the working population has a visible tattoo. My dog is snoring, by the way. I don't know if you hear that. But in any case, that's one other issue to think about, how this does shift over time. The second issue is that one's status group might lead, or at least lead to an increased likelihood of being labeled as deviant. So certain groups have higher likelihoods of having that label of deviant attached to them, tied to their what we call ascribed statuses, the aspects of ourselves that we're born with. So your physicality, your racial ethnicity, those aspects of our identities, unfortunately, have been tied to these deviant behaviors, and of course, we see a lot of this coming into play in a lot of the protests that we've seen over the past week plus. But just the trends that we've seen, just the differential treatment that we've seen in terms of policing and not even just formal policing, but even the norms, I guess, of people of color being just guarded a little bit more or watched a little bit more whenever those individuals are in public places or in department stores or whatever the case might be. Sometimes we do certainly see that, and there's a lot of evidence that shows that. So one historical evidence that we can look at, anecdotal, but this is tied to trends that we do see nationally, comes from the images that I'm going to show you here come from Hurricane Katrina. So this was quite some time back. But if you are old enough to remember, there were a series of pictures that were released in the media and specifically by the Associated Press. And so, for instance, this image here, the text of it, you can probably read it yourself. A young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans on Tuesday, August 30th, 2005. Floodwaters continue to rise in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, et cetera, et cetera. And then another similar image in terms of the content of the image itself. Somewhat different text. 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina came through the area in New Orleans, Louisiana. So generally the same image, or a similar image that's been captured in those photographs, but there's a key distinction that a lot of people picked up on in the media and certainly in the social sciences, and it was tied to the framing of these 2 individuals. So for this African American individual, the text framed them as looting a grocery store, whereas this white couple in the second picture framed them as finding bread and soda. So again, some people say, well, it's just words, it's not intentionally racist, not intentionally, trying to frame this black versus these white individuals differently. But that is still nonetheless, at the very least, an anecdotal instance that illustrates this idea that, at least to some extent, your racial or ethnic identity can influence how it is that you might be perceived, or at least how that similar action might be perceived. Are you looting or are you finding food? So bear that in mind. And another another quick example here. LGBTQ individuals in public, starting to see some shift in this over time, but historically we've seen that gay and lesbian couples, whenever there's any affection that they show one another in public, it's usually chastised as keep that in the bedroom, or get a room, that sort of thing. And it's primarily tied, or it seems to be tied to their sexual orientation. Because the reality is that straight people can get by with a lot more affection in public without the same sorts of critique. So a couple of specific examples to illustrate that. But moving on to our third consideration in deviance is that deviance can be expected, acknowledged, and allowed in certain instances. And that, again, just goes back to this idea of deviance being socially constructed. So we have rules in place. We have these parameters in terms of what's permissible and what's not, and what we see as a norm and acceptable behaviors versus what's framed as deviance. But there's always exceptions to that. And one main form of these exceptions to behavior is what sociologists refer to as institutionalized deviance. So this refers to those instances in which organizations or people in any form of authority can make those allowances in terms of what's permissible or not, or those exceptions to the rule. So historically, if we look at Senior Ditch Day, so that technically and formally, skipping school is against the rules, illegal, it violates school policy, etc. But historically, we've seen that principals and school administrators have exempted seniors, for that one day. Like, we know seniors are going to ditch school on this one particular day. They've worked hard for 4 years. We're going to let this pass, let them celebrate, let them have, this one last day at the beach, the lake, whatever it might be. So that's a good example of institutionalized deviance. There is this exception where if you engage in that behavior on any other day, there would probably be sanctions for that behavior. And then a second example comes from the Amish community. And this is Rumspringa, which is it's almost like a rite of passage for Amish teens. So typically when we think about Amish communities, we think, horse and buggies and, very much the simple life, no electricity, not even any buttons on their clothing, that sort of thing. So very, what mainstream America would probably see as very narrow, very straight-laced, etc. There is this, like I said, this rite of passage for teens in Amish communities to actually go out and engage in deviant behaviors. So drink, smoke, have sex, do all those sorts of things that teens typically are not encouraged to do. And we would imagine that's particularly the case in Amish communities. So here's a couple of images from a documentary on Rumspringa, where, like I said, Amish teens are kind of given this free pass to do all the quote unquote bad things during that rite of passage. And the goal of this is, which is actually kind of a smart tactic, I guess, is that after Rumspringa ends, these teens are asked to make a decision. Do you want to recommit yourself to the Amish community and to Amish lifestyle, or do you want to become mainstream America or join mainstream America from that point evermore? So overwhelmingly, these teens do choose to recommit themselves to the Amish life or the Amish lifestyle. But in some ways, it's just this short time span where they're allowed to get it out of their system. So interesting to see the reality of that and just hear how these norms and these expectations of deviance are violated over time. I'm going to pause it and then upload the last item next.